from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. We're going to talk about war in the Middle East. We're going to talk about boots on the ground, and this will be our strategic risk assessment talk. We're going to talk about this war that has embroiled pretty much the entire Middle East, but it even goes beyond that. Arguably, one could say it's gone into parts of Europe. I'm still waiting to find out what this explosion was that took place outside of the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Oslo. But there's been other issues with that. Drones going up to Azerbaijan. Drones ostensibly from Hezbollah. We'll talk more about that. Going into Cyprus to a British base, which is technically sovereign British territory, and some other things. And going into Turkey. So anyway, we're going to talk about all that. Talk about what boots on the ground may look like in Iran and why it may be absolutely necessary that is the next phase of this campaign, and why, and perhaps that may answer why the White House tends to be a little vague on that. Obviously, things have changed in a week. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of March, if you will, we had literally beforehand, we had gone in, so to speak. Massive strikes on a variety of Iranian targets by the U.S. and Israel. Of course, that amazing decapitation strike that took out the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, and about 49 of his top officials, which basically, from what I can tell, kind of put the entire government in disarray because it took out so many top officials. And there is, I won't get into it now, but an amazing intelligence effort that was behind it. And of course, the fact that they all were there in a place where they could be hit actually kind of drove the timing on the strike itself. So anyway, that's part of what's going on, but there's also, all these things have happened and striking up into Central Asia with Azerbaijan, the Mediterranean on Cyprus and British territory on Cyprus. Anyway, this has resulted in a lot of things that have changed. All right. First off, I want to just say one thing. It's also resulted in Hezbollah. We've talked about Hezbollah for a long time, based out of Lebanon, backed by the Revolutionary Guard Corps' thing called Al-Quds, a terrorist paramilitary force controlling huge chunks of southern Lebanon, right up into southern parts of Beirut, and just the bane of existence for the Lebanese government, the bane of existence for Israel. Pretty much everybody's bane of existence except for maybe Assad, Syria, and Iran itself. But anyway, they were in a ceasefire agreement with Israel. Keep in mind, they were routinely violating the ceasefire agreement. Hence, Israel was occasionally doing airstrikes in there. But it had largely kind of held. But the question on this was, will Hezbollah join in with Iran? And prior to anything, there was a lot of discussion. And it sounded like, well, Hezbollah may sit this one out. They may decide it's not worth it for them. Except that there was something that happened within Hezbollah. When Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, was taken out, and all of his top senior leadership folks, with a variety of strikes, not to mention that amazing pager attack followed by the walkie-talkie or radio attack, that it left them with a dearth of leadership, particularly a dearth of military, tactical, operational leadership, which was apparently filled by the Revolutionary Guard Corps and its Al-Quds force. So they had literally moved over operatives into Lebanon to kind of run things, while the Hezbollah Lebanese side just lacked the leadership, tactical, operational manpower in order to pull this off. So what has happened is they joined in. And they joined in. They've launched stuff down into Israel. They launched the Cyprus thing I talked about. Bottom line is they are now fully in, and they are essentially a paramilitary arm of the Revolutionary Guard Corps operating in southern Lebanon. And of course, Israel is responding to that the exact way you'd expect them to. They're doing a series of devastating airstrikes, and they have moved troops that they already have positions in southern Lebanon. They've moved more troops into southern Lebanon to reinforce those positions. They've mobilized 100,000 reservists. Anyway, they're ready to go. They're ready to go for a ground war up there. Really, the Shiite militias in Iraq, which were for some time, there was even talk about with the Iraqi government that these militias would disarm, they would cease to be paramilitary forces, they were going to basically just become part of the body politic of Iraq, and the militias themselves had agreed to be under the overall umbrella of the military, the Ministry of Defense in Iraq. Anyway, all that had been happening, but when this thing took off with Iran, they started doing more stuff. They started launching attacks on U.S. forces and things like that. And that basically invited both U.S. and Israeli airstrikes, and it really brings into a lot of questions, particularly if they are actually part of, and this may sound like I'm parsing words here, but if they are technically part of Iraq's Ministry of Defense, okay, does that mean that Iraq's Ministry of Defense has attacked the U.S. and Israel? I'm sure the government would say absolutely not, and they would put a lot of distance between them. But I will say this, you can't own them and disown them in the same breath. They're going to have to figure out what they want to do, and this may be a very difficult time for Iraq's government as they're trying to figure out what's going on, which also brings up some things with the Kurds that I may mention a little bit later, but that's another issue. The only part of the proxy axis of resistance Iranian proxy network that really has me kind of intrigued is what are the Houthis going to do in Yemen? And I think they're trying to grasp what could be for them truly an existential moment, because if they don't have Iranian support, they are completely surrounded by folks that want to see them gone. Whether it's the Yemeni government, the Saudis, the UAE, the Omanis certainly don't want to see them there. And I would say if they crossed over the water, I don't think anybody in the Horn of Africa wants to see them there. So they're in kind of an existential crisis. Now, if they start, firing anti-ship missiles and doing all the stuff they were doing before, they've got a problem because there's going to be no missiles incoming to ever replace those. The supply lines going back to Iran are done. That is shut down. So they're trying to figure out. I think they may eventually feel compelled politically that they have to do something like fire anti-ship missiles, and I think what's going to happen is that will eventually lead to their annihilation, and I can only guess how that annihilation will come about, but that's the one that's out there. Now, here's the facts on the ground in Iran. From day 1 to day 5, we saw a lot of ballistic missiles and we saw a lot of drones, but the reality is that the ballistic missile launches declined in that period by close to 90%. That's significant. Drone deployments dropped in that period by about 91% from their peak on day 2 of the war. So that's pretty significant in terms of the decline, and there's a lot of reasons for that, so I'm going to get into that. It's likely due to a combination of things. A lot of it's the very effective and ongoing U.S.-Israeli strike campaign against their ballistic missile stockpiles, especially against their launchers, their TELs, which are the transporter erector launch system thing that what lifts the missiles up so they can fire up. What they did was they said, look, they got thousands of missiles. They only got maybe 100 or a couple hundred of these launchers, so let's aim at the launchers. You take out the launchers, they can have a whole tunnel full of ballistic missiles, but they can't shoot them anywhere. So that appears to be working very, very well. All right, mostly destroyed by strike aircraft, and also I think a lot of the Iranian operators who were doing this stuff realized that they were being detected and destroyed by his aircraft as well. And it may be there's some potential for a rationing of these missiles and drones by Tehran, looking at a longer sustained conflict and fearful that they're going to run out. And it's also worth pointing out that they want to retain a credible deterrent, all right? And they lost a lot during that 12-day war in June with Israel. So all of these are things to look at. The impact of recent missile and drone attacks has been pretty significant. Tehran has fired over 500 ballistic missiles, over 2,000 drones, a lot of those are Shahed 136 drones. Military installations all over the Gulf, to include all over these Gulf countries. They've also been firing into these countries, hitting hotels and critical infrastructure and residential areas. And at first you'd say, well, maybe they shot down a drone and it landed on a hotel, or they shot down a ballistic missile and it landed in a residential area. That's not the case. What's become very clear is they're doing that to intimidate, terrorize, if you will, these Arab countries in hopes that they will kick out the U.S. presence. That's simply not going to happen. What happened was that these countries across the Gulf, particularly members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, but also Jordan in addition to that, basically turned their heads towards Iran and said, you are the enemy and you are attacking us, and put this in very stark national security terms for each one of these countries. I have never seen the Gulf Cooperation Council move that quickly on something. That was really stunning to see that. All right, so that's what they did. It completely backfired on them. But I think with every drone and missile they fire that lands on Arab territory, they just reinforce that visceral hatred. And these are countries, a lot of them, who had cordial diplomatic relations with Iran. They didn't necessarily like Iran, but they dealt with them okay, and they tried to, mollify Iran in a lot of different ways and stuff. And sometimes they were kind of frustrating to us because of what they were doing. But that's what was going on. The countries that they have aimed at, that they have struck, I should say, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Jordan. I'm sorry, I think I may have started reading these again. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Turkey. As I mentioned, the British base in Cyprus that was hit by Hezbollah drones, but that still is a hit. And of course, they fired a ton of stuff at Israel. And I know that some will say, Cyprus was a Hezbollah attack. I'm going to argue very, very strongly that it's kind of turned into a paramilitary arm of the Al-Quds force of the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. Despite extensive air and missile defense efforts from the U.S. and its partners throughout, some of these missiles, some of these drones have not been intercepted, and they have struck targets, and they have killed 7 American service members, 7 American military as of the latest count. The quantity of ballistic missiles employed by Iran's conflict since April of 2024, if you remember, in 2024, there were 2 back and forths between Israel and Iran that has been growing a lot. And the regime has clearly learned and increasingly tried to overwhelm the air defenses of its. They've learned a lot in the last couple of years. They're just trying to overwhelm the air defenses of Israel and the other countries involved. In April of 2024, I think they fired about 120 missiles, all right? In October of 2024, they fired over 200 ballistic missiles, and each of those exchanges occurred in less than 24 hours, just to give you an idea of what that's about. In June of 2025, the famous 12-day war between Iran and Israel, Tehran fired about 550 ballistic missiles in total. That's kind of interesting when you look at what they, if you start doing it by a 24-hour count, you're saying, it is getting a little bit less. So in other words, the quantity of missiles launched in the 4 days of the current of war is comparable to what it fired in the 12 days of the last conflict. All right, just to give you an idea of how they're spreading this stuff out a lot bit. It also gives you an idea of maybe how their command and control and a lot of other things were kind of degraded by the initial strikes by the U.S. and Israel. Nevertheless, all right, the rate of Iran's ballistic missile launches is lower than what was probably expected. And especially for a battle or a war, however you want, a conflict, that certainly the regime would see as existential. And if there was any doubt in that, President Trump came out and started talking about regime change right from the beginning. Now, yes, you can say, well, he kind of backed off that, and that's not the current objectives and stuff. Yeah, but it was out there, it was said, and certainly from the Iranian position, they would have seen that the U.S. and certainly Israel are dead set on regime change, and that means the end of the current regime. Now, that's just to kind of put this into a thing. Now, this has been a decrease in the, rapidly since the beginning of this thing took place, but Iran's ability to hit the U.S. and our partners in the region is also dropping, according to the head of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper. And he said that on March 3rd. Now, the Wall Street Journal has had some rather interesting articles talking about the ballistic missiles and the drones in Iran, and talking about this underground network that includes huge areas they sometimes call underground ballistic missile cities, where they store these ballistic missiles and where they store a lot of drones and other critical assets, other facilities, to include things tied to their nuclear program and things tied to, obviously, command and control. So that these huge underground shelters. Last June, you may recall that we had a B-2 bomber strike one of their nuclear sites that just did this amazing hit, and then we had Tomahawks missiles hit two other sites. But in the B-2 strike, the way they described it was they blew the top off of a ventilation shaft, and then they dropped precision-guided munitions down the ventilation shaft. I was having flashbacks of Luke Skywalker in Star Wars as they were explaining what they did. Just an amazing, amazing strike. All right. But satellite images suggest Iran's missile cities that were built to protect this arsenal are becoming very vulnerable because the U.S. and Israel have been using phenomenal amounts of intelligence assets to try and locate them, particularly trying to locate where their launch positions are, where the openings for the tunnels are, where the ventilation shafts are. All those things that would be essential that you'd want to know if you were to conduct a strike mission. So all this stuff is things that we have done, incredible intelligence preparation of the battle space, if you will, to basically identify what they are. And these things were built over a long period of time, decades in some case, to shield their arsenal from many attacks. But now, because all their missiles and all their drones are in these huge underground shelters, it's kind of a vulnerability. If we know where those shelters are, we have ways of dealing with them. And we have seen that we have new advanced strike munitions that we can drop from aircraft. And that gets into where the U.S. and Israel are going. They've been keeping up surveillance on these sites. In some cases, been reports that using that Lucas, that low-cost unmanned aerial combat system, that drone that was based on the Shahed 136, that they've been literally sitting over the top of these things and loitering and just waiting for something to pop out and then coming down and hitting it. Also, we have aircraft that have been loitering, and when something pops up, they go in and hit it. And this is a concept sometimes we used to call sensor to shooter, which is how soon can we locate something and then put, kinetic force on whatever it is. And we've obviously closed that gap a lot. Also, Wall Street Journal says that satellite images show that damage caused to launchers and also the debris that's burned in around the entrance of these show that we have been very, very effective in this regard. Now, it's believed that Tehran's remaining stockpile of thousands of medium short-range missiles are primarily in these underground bases. And again, these underground bases are not a big secret to the U.S. and Israel. And whereas they were designed to shield these missiles from airstrikes, the fact that they're in one place makes them a really, really big target that's easy to. Now, once air supremacy, and I should probably back up a little bit, we have air superiority, which means we dominate the airspace over Iran. In certain parts of Iran, we have what's called air supremacy. And these are limited areas where we basically are uncontested. We can fly in there and hit things at will without much or any concern that they will be contested by air defense weaponry. And obviously, we would want to get to the point where Israel kind of was getting darn close to at the end of the 12-day war, where we have air supremacy over, if not all of Iran, at least over large parts of Iran, so that we can conduct a lot of missions at will without having to worry about air defense. All right. Now, when we talk about boots on the ground, we often evoke images of Desert Storm and the liberation of Kuwait, something I know very, very much about, or the opening weeks of Operation Iraqi Freedom and the big march up to Baghdad. You may know a few things about Iraq too, but this is different. These would be raids. If we do boots on the ground, they would probably be raids, special operations raids, which could be anything from top tier 1 operators, so to speak, all the way down to larger units like using Rangers or Marines in a special operation role, or a lot of other things that could be done in this arena. And I could also see something where we may want to do something with, maybe provide airlift to bring in Israeli commandos who have been doing raids like this consistently for quite some time, and that they would go in there and, maybe the place is buried deep underground. So I think there was one tunnel they said was maybe 1,600 feet underground. That's a long way. And that they would go in there and basically destroy the facility and what's in the facility the old-fashioned way, kind of like World War II sort of stuff. The other option, though, is that they could simply find every entrance, everything, and blow it up in such a way that it denies the Iranians access to their weapons and certainly destroys all their launch capabilities, and would basically lock all these ballistic missiles and drones in these underground facilities in a way that the Iranians can't use them. That's another option as well. That could be boots on the ground. But to get to the boots on the ground, they're going to be looking at getting air supremacy over all, or at least large parts of Iran, so that we can get our raid forces in there safely and get them out safely as best we can. And in fairness, sometimes it is better to blow up the entrances and blow up certain parts of it, not the whole thing, because you can imagine that these underground facilities might be booby-trapped. There could be, suicidal ambushers down there who are willing to do anything to stop the invading force or whatever. There's a lot of reasons for that. Now, let's take another look at this. They have shut down 20% of the world's oil by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. has said, well, we're going to deal with the risk that mariners face, and we're going to escort those ships through this area with naval presence. We haven't quite kicked that off yet, but the thing that Iran has, even though we pretty much destroyed their navy, destroyed their air force, is they do have thousands of small boats that the Revolutionary Guard Corps uses. They have small midget submarines that the Revolutionary Guard Corps uses, and they have a lot of sea mines, which the Revolutionary Guard Corps controls. So obviously from all that, you can infer destroying the Revolutionary Guard Corps is very high on our list of things to do. But I would also mention that when you're looking at these revetments, these tunnels, these underground places where they might be keeping anti-ship missiles, places where they might be hiding those boats along the coastline, things along that order, that does open it up to something the Marine Corps spent decades and decades and decades working on, which is called amphibious raids. And so you may see the Marine Corps practicing its amphibious raid tactics and specialized equipment. And if you go back many, many years ago, I was actually a part of this amphibious raid capability that the Marine Corps had. So I'm more than passingly familiar with what the Marine Corps can do in this regard. And I would point out that Iran has an extremely long coastline that goes up through the Indian Ocean, through the Gulf of Oman, through the Strait of Hormuz, into the Red Sea. They have got a really big coastline. And I'm not even talking about the Caspian Sea up north. They've got this big coastline that they have to defend, and you can't defend everywhere. And certainly with the lack of command and control and communications capability they have now, defending would be very difficult, and they don't have enough troops to defend everything. And if they can't communicate and we have air supremacy, they can't move reaction or response forces fast enough to reinforce any of these raid sites. So it's like we go in and we hit an underground missile site. Well, they may not have the forces to respond to that, may be located elsewhere. Well, they can't get down the road without coming under airstrikes, which means they may not be able to get there at all. Same thing with the amphibious raids. They may be trying to stop the amphibious raid force, but if we got air supremacy over that area, anything they do to try and reinforce that, we'll hit it with air. And this is called combined arms warfare, something I know a few things about, and it works very, very well. All right. Yes, air war alone cannot win a war, but you don't have to always invade with a large army to cause regime change. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. So anyway, what does this all mean? Well, this means that the campaign, as we incrementally or gradually get air supremacy, is going to transition. By the way, this concept of sealing up caves and tunnels and all that stuff, that's the same thing the U.S. did, especially the Marine Corps and the Army did in the Pacific back in World War II. This is not a new concept. I should mention that. All right. Now, as we get air supremacy, I think the showcasing maybe of what these incredible ground forces that we have that can do these raids so well. We got a sense of what we're capable of when we went in and took Maduro. And I think a lot of people are like, wow, I didn't know we could do stuff like that. Yes, we could do stuff like that. Now, those were tier one top operators. Those are the guys that do that. They train harder and they do that more than anybody else. But for a lot of stuff we're talking about here, you don't need to have the very, very top tier operators, the ones that can, snatch a national leader out of their, underground shelter. You just simply need a force that is trained well, that's very professional. You can get in there and hit a site in a very coordinated, cohesive manner in order to neutralize that location for whatever purpose it's being used for, whether it's being used to launch drones, launch missiles, whatever it is. That's what we're looking for. Now, before the Iranian people would ever return to the streets in the ways we saw in December and January, they're going to want to make sure that they're not going to get killed. First off, they want to make sure that we're not actually accidentally going to kill them with airstrikes. And honestly, a lot of the airstrikes have, as they will, because there's a lot of very dense urban areas, some of those airstrikes come very close to hitting, populated civilian areas. In fact, there's a possibility that we may have made a tremendous mistake striking an IRGC facility that was near a school, primarily a girls' school, and that could have been, there's a lot of reporting that could have been a U.S. strike. It was not. I want to make clear, there's no way in the world was that ever intentional. A lot of times, particularly when you're doing airstrikes and a lot of these missions, you can get bad information, you can get bad intelligence, or you can just have a sequence of really bad things happen where there's somehow a miscalculation and that ordnance will hit something that was not the intended target. That's what I can almost guarantee that's what you're going to find here, is that, if it was U.S., if it wasn't a errant Iranian missile, which is something I've certainly thought was very, very possible until that's completely ruled out. I'll still think it's an option that we need to look at closely. We don't target civilians intentionally, but sometimes they do end up getting caught in the crossfire. When the populace knows they can come out, they're not going to be stopped by the Revolutionary Guard Corps or its enormous volunteer paramilitary militia that was formed by the Revolutionary Guard Corps way back when, called the Besiege. When they know that these guys are not going to come out and try to kill them, arrest them en masse, whatever, conduct executions, once they're sure of that, then they will probably come out en masse. That means that part of this transition will be moving from taking out these big things like missile launch sites and drone launch sites and everything else to also dismantling the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Besiege. And we're already hearing that is being done. Once all these things are achieved, someone's going to have to explain to me how the regime survives. Once all these things, if the ballistic missiles are either gone or stopped to a trickle, if the drones are gone or stopped to a trickle, if the Revolutionary Guard Corps can't go down the street to stop, Iranian people from overrunning government buildings and overtaking the seats of power within Iran, well, then I would say that the day is done. In fact, I say that Ayatollah Khomeini's second son was just chosen as the second supreme leader. I think that's interesting theater that at the end of the day won't mean much. Hey, thanks for listening to STRAT. You can also turn to stratpodcast.com. You can also go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV, or you can also go to my corporate website, www.gripsa, G-R-I-P-S-A, that's gripsa.com. And if you're interested in something a little bit longer and a little bit more in depth, you can also go to the Los Angeles InfraGard website. And on March 18th, I'm doing a 2.5-hour global threat update. Yes, I'll be talking a lot about the war in the Middle East. I'll also be talking about what's going on in Ukraine. I'll be talking about what's happening in the Western Hemisphere. I'll be talking about what's happening in the Far East. I'll be talking about what's happening in the Arctic. I'll be talking about just about everything. And it is a global threat update, and hopefully you'll be able to tune in. That's March 18th, and my understanding is that we're going to do an encore presentation. So if you can't make it that morning, there will be an encore presentation that goes immediately afterwards over the next couple days. Anyway, thanks for listening to Strat. Hope you tune in for the next one, which will be very, very soon. And I'm going to talk about this Shield of the Americas and what this means going after the drug cartels.